Hey guys, Jake Tribbey here from fantasypoints.com to give you an early look at the week 18 DFS slate. Obviously, week 18, there's a lot up in the air in regards to motivation. Who's going to play for these teams that are already eliminated from the playoffs or, really don't have anything to gain from winning their games. So definitely going to want to keep an eye on beat reports throughout the week to get a better idea of who's going to play. But yeah, for this early look, we're going to get into some of the best values and overall top plays for the upcoming slate. And obviously, like I said, a lot can change from now until Sunday when the slate kicks off. But yeah, these are the guys that kind of jumped out to me upon first look. So the quarterback that we're gonna talk about, I mean, there's a few decent options, but there's one guy who really sticks out to me this week, and it's Geno Smith. Seattle is still fighting for a playoff spot. A win against the Rams this week would lift their playoff probability to 39%, while a loss eliminates them entirely. And I'm rather optimistic about Seattle's offense for fantasy purposes, given they're 6.5 point favorites while offering a 24-point implied team total, which is actually the sixth highest implied team total of the Week 18 main slate. In his 5 games this season as a favorite, Geno Smith averages 24 fantasy points per game, which would rank third among all quarterbacks over the full season. And when these teams last played in week 13, Seattle actually posted their second highest pass rate over expectation of the year. They really put the game in Smith's hands and let him chuck it. The only serious knock on Smith's upside case this week is that the Rams are a bottom 10 schedule adjusted matchup for opposing quarterbacks. And while that's obviously not great, the Rams defense does have a major weakness, and it's covering outside wide receivers. Los Angeles is the third softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing outside wide receivers. And it just so happens that 49% of Seattle's total receiving yards this season have come from the outside wide receiver duo in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So Smith's matchup may not be great, but the overall offensive matchup is really strong, I think. And given that, Seattle is one of the limited number of teams that has quite a bit to gain from winning this week, I think I'm going to try to play it as safe as I can at quarterback, especially, and really just go with the guys who are going to be extremely motivated to put up a win. And Geno Smith certainly falls into that category. So moving on to running back, Brandon Staley, the Chargers head coach, was quoted as saying, "There's certainly an advantage to being the 5 seed from where I stand. So we're going to try and get there." That essentially means, assuming he's true to his word, that the Chargers are going to play their starters and try to win this game against the Broncos. Now, if that happens, I really like Austin Eckler this week. Denver is a brutal matchup for opposing offenses. That shows up in pretty much all the metrics, but they're especially brutal for opposing quarterbacks and wide receivers, ranking as a bottom 4 schedule adjusted matchup for both positions. The Broncos are a much closer to neutral matchup for opposing running backs, actually ranking as the 9th softest schedule adjusted matchup on the season. The last time these teams played, Austin Eckler earned a season high 16 targets, which was the 7th most targets by any player in any game this season. And I really don't think that was a coincidence. I know that the Chargers were down Keenan Allen in that contest, but Denver allows the 3rd lowest average depth of target and the 8th lowest deep throw rate. The Chargers were force feeding Eckler in this last game because Denver doesn't give up anything deep. And I'd expect something pretty similar in week 18, assuming both these teams can stay true to their tendencies and that the Chargers actually play to win this game. So I think among the high price guys, Eckler's probably my favorite. But again, this will all depend how ownership shakes out. Really tough to get a good gauge of ownership at this point in the week, given how much is unknown. But moving on to running back, one guy that I'm fairly confident is going to play and going to get a heavy workload this week is Cam Akers. The Rams have nothing to play for, but that hasn't stopped him from giving Akers the 8th biggest workload among running backs over the last 2 weeks, measured by expected fantasy points per game. Akers' role is close to that of a true bell cow. He's averaged 23 opportunities per game, 16 expected fantasy points per game, and a 76% snap share over the last 2 weeks. The only thing that's missing here is a reliable pass game role. Akers only has a combined 4 targets over that stretch. but his 42% route share still easily leads the backfield. I mean, no one else in this backfield is running routes. 42%, not great, but when the next closest guy is at like 14%, it's still pretty strong. And that further suggests that Akers will be heavily involved, even if the Rams fall behind, which is what's expected given they're a 6.5 point underdog. And this is an awesome matchup. Seattle's the fourth softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing running backs this season. They've allowed games of 51.3 DraftKings points. That was to Josh Jacobs, 36.7 DraftKings points, 28.8 DraftKings points, and 27.4 DraftKings points to individual running backs just this season. If you're game stacking the Seattle game, Akers is a crucial piece. And even as a one-off, I mean, he's really the only guy that I think you can reasonably look at on Los Angeles outside of maybe Tyler Higbee and Tutu Atwell. So yeah, I really like Akers in this plus matchup. And, I think that there's a decent chance actually that the Rams could win this game. And that could make Akers a potentially exciting pairing with the Rams defense. But we'll have to see how ownership shakes out there before we know how hard to push the Akers exposure. Moving on, there's another similarly priced running back that I wanted to highlight in Najee Harris. The Steelers need a win this week to maintain any playoff hopes, suggesting this offense should operate as normal. And over the last 4 weeks, Najee Harris has averaged 16 expected fantasy points per game, 15.9 fantasy points per game, 3.8 targets per game, and 3.8 red zone opportunities per game. Among slate eligible running backs, those numbers rank 5th best, 7th best, 10th best, and 3rd best. Obviously, Harris pops as a pretty strong value given he's the RB15 by DraftKings salary. And he draws a really great matchup. The Browns are the second softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing running backs on the ground, ranking as PFF's fourth worst graded run defense, while allowing the 5th most yards after contact per attempt, the 4th most yards before contact per attempt, and the 4th most missed tackles. In simpler terms, this is the perfect rushing matchup for Najee Harris, who should also get the benefit of positive game script with the Steelers listed as 2.5 point favorites. This is the kind of play where, if Harris is going to be one of the most popular plays of the slate, which I don't think he will, but that is possible. I think you can just full on fade him. But if Harris is going to clock in around, 5, hopefully no more than 10%, I think he's a really, really strong play. I mean, especially in like a lot of single entry 3-max stuff, he's going to be a really tough click just given how inefficient he's been this season. But, I think the just fantastic rushing matchup more than makes up for Harris's previous inefficiency. Moving on to wide receiver. Most of the guys that really jumped out to me were actually priced on the lower end. I mean, you can certainly make an argument for a lot of these higher priced wide receivers, but we still don't necessarily know what some of these teams that have clinched a playoff spot are going to want to do with their starters. So that made me scroll down a little bit to get to Garrett Wilson. So Wilson has absolutely smashed without Zach Wilson. Everyone's seen the splits. He's averaged 17.8 expected fantasy points per game since week 13, which ranks as both the 5th best mark by a wide receiver over the full season and the 5th best by any wide receiver since week 13. Wilson's matchup provides more reasons for optimism, given Miami is the 8th softest schedule adjusted matchup for opposing outside wide receivers since week 12. Wilson is clearly one of the best usage-based values of the Week 18 slate, with a strong matchup as the cherry on top. But it's not perfect. This game doesn't mean anything for the Jets. So would it really shock anyone if they decided to sit Wilson or limit his usage in order to keep him healthy for 2023? No, I don't think so. Mike White also has an underrated risk of benching. He hasn't thrown a touchdown and has 4 interceptions over his last 3 games. So there is some serious risk with this play, but it's still pretty absurd that Wilson is 5,800, given he's averaged 10.2 targets per game since week 13. Moving further down the wide receiver salaries here, the next guy that I wanted to highlight probably won't come as a surprise to some of the people who have watched this video over the last few weeks, and that's Rashid Shaheed. Shaheed has been notably more involved since Jarvis Landry was placed on injured reserve, setting a season-high 6 targets and 11.2 expected fantasy points in the Saints' Week 17 win against Philadelphia. So Shaheed's floor is solid, especially relative to his $4,200 price tag. He's hit at least 4 targets in his last 4 games, but his upside is really what takes him over the top as a DFS play. He scored 3 touchdowns of 40 or more yards on just 28 total touches this season. He's arguably one of the most explosive wide receivers in the NFL. And, given he has a solid floor, he comes off to me at least as a real steal at just 4,200. Now, again, the Saints don't have anything to play for. So it's tough. Maybe they end up playing all backups this week, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think they want to see what they have in Shaheed. I still think these games are important for a lot of teams just to see what they have in guys and to figure out how they're going to adjust personnel for 2023. So I think Shaheed plays, and I think he could get fed a monster workload. It makes more sense to me that they'd take it easier with someone like Chris Olave than they would with Shaheed. Okay, so moving on here, Greg Dortch is just egregiously mispriced. He's the full-time slot wide receiver in Arizona, which is extremely notable given he's averaged 9 targets per game and 15.5 fantasy points per game in the 6 games this season, where he's earned at least 25 slot routes. Over the last 2 weeks, Dortch has averaged 18.3 expected fantasy points per game, mark that would rank 7th best among all wide receivers over the full season, ahead of players like Mike Evans, CeeDee Lamb, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Dortch's floor is legitimately unmatched in this price range, rivaled only by wide receivers who cost twice as much. But I do think it's reasonable to question his ceiling after he fell 13.8 points below his usage implied expectation in week 17 due to David Blau's general incompetency at quarterback. Colt McCoy could play in week 18, but that's still very up in the air. If McCoy plays, Dortch is easily one of the top wide receiver plays of the entire slate. He'll be mega chalk again, probably around 35% owned, just like he was in week 17. And the same may be true from a median projection standpoint if David Blau is the quarterback. But it's pretty easy to get off Dortch, assuming Blau starts, just given that, this is an offense that could, only score 10 points over the entirety of the game. And obviously, San Francisco is an absolutely brutal matchup for opposing offenses. So, I could pretty easily see Arizona having a lot of trouble moving the ball, especially if they don't have Colt McCoy at quarterback. But at the same time, getting 9 targets per game at 3,800 is just, it's unmatched. It's really tough to get away from that in any sort of cash format. So yeah, I really like Dortch as a play. He's going to pop as a value almost no matter what. But again, in tournaments, not too hard to get away from him. Okay, at tight end, there's a lot of guys that you can make a pretty strong case for, but the guy who jumped out to me may actually come as a bit of a surprise. It's Albert O. So Albert O, Greg Dulcich is on IR right now, and Albert O emerged as the lead tight end for Denver in week 17, posting a 58% route share, 6 targets, and 10.1 expected fantasy points, which was the 13th best workload among week 17 tight ends. Should this usage continue into week 18, I'm optimistic about Albert O's upside, given that he's an absolute freak athlete. I know he got steamed a ton in the offseason. He was best ball, tight end 14, tight end 15. Everyone was hyping up this dude's athleticism, and he just ended up being inactive for the vast majority of games this season. There's definitely risk here given Denver has absolutely nothing to play for, but that didn't stop them from keeping their starters in for the entirety of their meaningless week 17 game. They should be forced to throw as 3.5 point underdogs. And, if they end up going pass heavy, Albert O is going to get a lot of routes, and I think you could do a lot worse at 2,900. Now, this does come with the caveat that if Albert O is going to be one of the more popular tight ends of the slate, I'm not going to touch him. I think there's too much risk there to indulge, a heavily owned Albert O. But, if he's around 5% owned, you could do a lot worse punting tight end. So yeah, that just about wraps up everyone that I wanted to talk through for this week 18 early look. Remember to keep an eye on beat reports, and we will have a much better grip of this slate here in 2 to 3 days as we're doing DFS values, and Scott Barrett does a slate breakdown. We should have a lot more confidence in some of the guys that we are touting then. But yeah, until next time, guys, it's been a fantastic regular season, and appreciate you tuning in to the Week 18 early look.